Hopefully you heard there how important that is. So just quickly, I'll run through what I've done. Low pass filter, we've already got one. If you make pop punk music, then you'll probably need a guitar tone for some octave lead parts that sound like this. You'll probably need a guitar tone for leads that sound like this. And you'll definitely have rhythm guitar parts that need a tone like this. So here's how to get all those guitar tones that you'll likely need for your pop punk music. So starting with that rhythm tone, you'll probably want something like this. So I'm using this white head here, the crunch head, which is effectively a JCM 800, or at least it sounds a lot like one. I'm using the cab from the 5150 that comes with the same plugin. And I want to point out this is not the Nolly X. I do not like the Nolly X. This is the one before. And I believe if you've bought the Nolly X, you can actually download this as like a previous version if you go onto the legacy downloads part of the Neural DSP website. Just a side note. So one important distinction for punk rock rhythm tones from things like metal and hard rock and stuff like that is that you can't have too much gain. It's fine if you've got like a riff with 1 or 2 notes, but when you're doing a chord, a rhythm chord, that gain just adds up to noise and you don't get any definition from the tone. And when I do one-on-one mixing tutorials with people, I often find that it's too much gain in a rhythm tone like this that's causing a lot of the problems. I've got it set just before 5 here. The bass is whacked up full, but we're going to do a high pass filter later on with EQ. The treble is pushed a little bit bright, but not too bright. I haven't touched any of this here on the right hand side, but I want to bring your attention to the mids. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know I love to push the mids because that brings your guitars forward in the mix, because that's actually where your guitars are going to live. If you think about it, you've got the bass with the low end, you've got vocals, cymbals, lead guitar all at the high end. And then there's this whole area of mids that often gets missed out. And if your songs sound like there's maybe something missing or like there's a hole in the frequencies, it's probably this mid-range area here, which your guitars sit perfectly in, providing you don't use too much gain. And the bright switch here is also engaged because we want nice, bright rhythms for this kind of thing. If I bring all these back to 5, let me just show you. So if you're not using the Nolly, you're using a different JCM 800 amp sim, you can go for the same sound. First of all, let's affect the gain knob. And hopefully you'll see why I've settled for just a little bit before 5. Now, try and hear that as 2 sounds. You've got all that definition. It's kind of sounds boxy at the moment. And then when I whack that gain up, that definition is still there. It's a bit louder, but you've also got this noise. So you've almost got like the definition and the noise. So when I pull the gain knob back, I keep the definition, I keep the energy, but I lose that noise. And that's going to help when we've got distortion, we've got frequencies all over the place with the whole mix. You don't want to add to the distortion of the mix and lose the clarity by having your guitars this gainy too. So I'll bring that back and see if you can hear the noise disappear, but we're going to keep that definition. You can hear it change when we get to 6. Let me pop that back up to 10 and I'll show you again. So in my opinion, that's as far as we can go with that gain before we start to just add in noise for no reason. I always try to get away with as little gain as possible because I know when I've got octaves and I've got lead parts coming in, all that gain's going to add up. So if I can get away with a little bit less gain from the rhythms, I will do, but this is personal preference and you can push it to about there if that's what you feel comfortable with. You can see it's a lot cleaner or a lot clearer when I put it just before the 5. But if you want it a bit dirtier, you can go for that 6. I'd be comfortable to do that too if I wanted a bit of a more dirty, raw sound. Now we're going to whack the bass up to 10 because I want the amp to be reacting fully to all the frequencies. And then we're going to control that with an EQ later. Now we're going to push the treble up a little bit, just to get a bit more brightness out of it. But we are going to use a top end shelf later on with a EQ. Cool, so about there, a bit more we could get away with, but the more we push it, the more we're going to introduce those sort of like whistly resonant frequencies that we don't really want. Now, the important thing coming next is the mids, and we're going to make this tone boxy, and it probably is going to sound a little worse in solo, but the idea is when the whole mix is there, you're pushing those guitars forward because they're not competing in the mids with as much as they are in the top end, and you're not just going to have loads of stuff just building up. You're going to get your definition, you're going to push your guitars forward, and that's cool. And that's why I love this Nolly plugin so much, because you can push those mids and they bring the guitars forward and it doesn't sound too bad. It doesn't sound too boxy. We're going to refine it a little bit, but you can really bring that forward. Let's try these guitars in with the bass and drums, and hopefully you can hear what I mean, how those mids bring that guitar forward. So I'll scoop it to start with. Let's bring everything else in. You hear how tonally you might prefer the scooped mids, but when you've got everything in, you can't really hear the guitars. You push those mids and they start to really come forward in that area, unchallenged really from the rest of what's happening. I promise you this is important. And yes, it's a little bit boxy and you can hear a bit of honk in there, but we're going to refine that. Okay, so the other parts of this amp, which I'm using are, we've got this tube screamer pedal engaged here. We've got the drive off and the tone pushed a little bit to make it brighter. And this really helps clean up your low mids. If you've ever recorded your guitar in a real studio with some engineers and producers, it's likely that they would have used a tube screamer in this way when going into the amp. It's how I learned the trick myself, was recording in a proper studio. And I was always curious as to why we had a drive pedal with the drive off, because it really helps clean up those lower mids. Let's have a listen. Quite a drastic change to the tone, and it definitely is still getting saturated, of course it is, and that's what's helping to shape it and give it a bit more drive and energy. And if you wanted a more sort of spangly sounding tone, you could turn that off. Listen to the sort of jingle you get out of it now. That really helps with that sort of pick attack spangliness, I guess you'd call it. I'm not using the EQ. On the cab section here, we're just using the 157, and it's pretty much on this line that you'll see here. You've got that inner circle of the cone where it meets the sort of outer part of the cone here. Typically where engineers will put their 57 actually. Okay, so let's refine this tone more. Like I said, we're going to use some EQ. This is a Pro Q3, but of course you can use anything. We've got low and high pass filters here. This is controlling the slope of the low pass filter, so we had the bass up full in the amp so that it would react properly to the whole frequency spectrum of the DI. Then we're going to roll off what we don't need here. So it's up to 84 hertz with a 12 decibel per octave slope. Again, up here, a bit of a tighter slope, 24 decibels per octave, 10K. And then these are just some resonant frequencies here, and we've got a couple of these honky moments being taken care of down here. So let me show you what these EQs are doing. See, I'm completely keeping the tone and the character. I'm just taking away the little bits that aren't so pleasant. What I can hear most prominently when I bypass this EQ is that whistly resonant frequency happening. See if you can hear that. Yeah, and I'll quickly take you through each cut so you can hear why they're important. So those two frequencies that I've cut there are what's sort of causing that honk to be overpowering. So you cut those out and the tone becomes a lot clearer, and you still keep those mids with that big mid boost that we had. We've just refined the bits that weren't so pleasant, so we've got the best of both worlds there. Now let's listen to these resonant frequencies with those little whistly tones. I mean, that's just pure harshness there. So yeah, you get the idea. And these little arrows here mean that I've engaged the dynamic EQ mode in Pro Q3, so it reacts to how strong that frequency is and will duck it more if it needs to. If you have that functionality in your EQ, then brilliant, use it, but it's not necessary. It just helps to maintain a more sort of even tone, but it's not do or die. Okay, next up we've got Soothe. This is an expensive plugin, so I understand if it's not something that's necessarily available to everyone, but this just deals with an extra bit of harshness. The reason I put this on here is because I want to be quite dramatic with my shelf that I'm going to do in the next stage. So any ways I can take out resonant frequencies and hiss and sort of that digital noise you get with amp sims, then I will do, so I can be more dramatic with my boost. So I'll show you what this is doing. Yeah, just a little bit of extra hiss, a little bit of extra noise and fizz just being taken out there. The tone sounds a little bit more defined with that. Okay, so now some magic, which is this top end shelf I've been talking about. And I'm using my trusty ancient SSL channel from Waves. This isn't the fancy new ones that they do. This isn't the fancy Brainworks one. This is the 2008, probably not that old, I don't know, SSL channel from Waves. I'm going to bypass the EQ, but the minute I bring this on, the tone's going to get bright and open up and suddenly come to life. Yeah, and in solo, that sounds a little bit dramatic, and there brings back quite a bit of that like hiss and noises in there too. But in the context of the mix, you don't really hear that. So I would recommend doing something like this with the mix. I wouldn't do this in solo because you're never going to do it as hard or as dramatic as you need to. Hopefully you heard there how important that is. So just quickly, I'll run through what I've done. Low pass filter, we've already got one, but I just feel like it changes the low mids a little bit. So I always put this in. I always set this to about 12.5 or 12K. And these slopes are super gentle, by the way, built into this plugin. So you're not exactly killing everything under 80 Hertz. You're just setting it at 80, but the slope is gentle. Same with the top end one here. Nothing else is being engaged, but then we've got this huge 8K shelf. So it's not a bell, it's a shelf. And I push it as bright as I need to go in the context of the mix. Yeah, there we go. And to me, that sounds cool. I like that. You know, the mids are going to make it a little dull, but you want that definition in there. So I find I'm always pushing a bit more brightness. The more mixes I do for people, actually, I tend to be pushing more and more brightness. But you sort of learn to cut what you need to cut in the stages before this, so you can really push this top end without it getting harsh and bringing back those resonant frequencies. So that's cool. And just quickly, if you make music like this and you want me to mix your next release, then head over to my website, terrybeckleyrecording.com. Scroll to the bottom and fill out the contact form there, and I will get back to you. Okay, so last couple of plugins on this tone then, before we move on to the octaves and the leads. I've got a compressor. This is just to give it a bit of grip. It's already, it's a distorted tone, so it doesn't actually have much dynamics to work with or that you need to control. But this adds a cool vibe. The Renaissance Axe from Waves, and it's sort of made for guitars, made for stringed instruments. But I pulled the attack back as far as 12 here. I think the default is 5. I didn't want to ruin that pick attack that I had in there. So this might just sound like a big volume jump, and it does push the guitars forward by making them a bit louder. But hopefully you can hear a kind of subtle bit of attitude in it. You can just kind of hear a little bit of squeeze, and it sort of pins those rhythms where they need to be. Really subtle, you don't need it, but I like that sort of little bit of squeeze it gives it. Then finally, we've got some saturation. This is the non-linear summer from Waves on the Neve. Use Fab Filter if you have the money, the Saturn 2. It's just saturation, it's just a bit of color. I guarantee it's very subtle. Yeah, subtle, but I love what saturation does. It kind of just places it. You know, there's a tiny bit of change to the mid-range. I just like what this does to that. But there's no right or wrongs with saturation, really, apart from oversaturating. So find one that you like and one that you can hear. I wouldn't just chuck it on if you're not hearing any difference, because it's not needed. But I like the flavor it gives. Okay, so let's move on to these octaves. To remind you, they sound like this. Now, hopefully you can hear the mid-range presence in that tone, which is what I got really excited about. So I really want to share with you how I made this tone. And also what I haven't done with previous videos, but in my one-to-one sessions that I hold with people, I've sort of come to realize that people are snatching at seconds in my videos to try and use that as a reference for their guitar tones. And I only really play it for a couple of seconds at a time, so it must drive people crazy. So what I'm going to do, check the link in the description, and I'm going to put up, not the multi-tracks, but I'm going to put up the stems. So I'm going to put up these guitar tracks in solo for you to download. You can go ahead and use them as references when you're making your guitar tones without having to replay my video 400 times for that 2-second clip that you get to hear the guitars without anything else there. Sorry about that, everyone who's had to do that, if you have. Okay, so let's look at what this tone is. I used Amplitude 5 to get this, and this is a new addition. I haven't ever used this really much before. I love how many different amps you get. I am quite critical of some of them. Like you'll see with this, I had to work quite hard to get rid of that amp sim like fizz and like fakeness that you don't really get with the neural stuff. But you've got so many different amps and they sound good. Like you have to work a little bit harder, but they sound good. And you get the cool room tone in there as well. And there's so much hardware. So I was pretty pleased with this. Anyway, so with these octaves, I used this Mesa Boogie Mark III because the mids just came forward when I put this on. And you might be able to see this sneaky tube screamer trick, same as the rhythm tone, where the drive is off and the tone is pushed to where I like it. So that runs in before the amp on both left and right channel here. Got it set to stereo. Cool. So these tones are exactly the same and these cabs are exactly the same. And the mixing is pretty much exactly the same. We've got the room on cab 1 and cab 2 is the same. It's just that this bus here, I've panned cab 1 to the left and cab 2 to the right because I want it to be a double tracked stereo guitar. Let's go through. So this is the EQ that comes as default. I didn't touch that in the end. I think I've tried to mess with it in the past when I first got the plugin, and actually if you can work with that EQ there, then great. Maybe nudge it around if you need to, but I was like, why do I want this 80? I'll kill that. But without that 80 up there, you lose a bit of character. So it's obviously there for a reason. Okay, so bass, not up all the way this time. It is a lead part. It is obviously higher up the neck anyway. I did push the mids like I always do. This is quite a mid-forward amp and cab anyway, but I pushed it to just like 6. And then this here, which I think is how you can like pull the pots out on the real amp, where it gives you like a bit of saturation there. Again, with this lead drive all the way up to 9. So let's just get rid of the EQ and stuff that I used afterwards. And you're going to hear the tone kind of fall apart a little bit. You'll see why I had to work a little bit harder, but it still sounds cool. So we'll do it in the context of the mix and then I'll solo it. It still sounds decent, but obviously with the EQs and stuff, it sounds better. Smoother, but the character and everything is already there in the amp. Anyway, get rid of all that, and let's look at the EQ. So it's effectively very similar to what we did with the rhythms. We've got our high pass and our low pass filters, similar sort of curves, 12 decibel per octave, 24 decibel per octave. But I've pulled a little bit more of the low mids out here at 200 because it's a lead part, you know. This was just a bit woofy. A bit more of that mid-range needed tightening up, so we've got a couple of mid-range cuts. Now this weird looking thing here is there's quite a dramatic spike at 2K. I'm not sure if it's the amp or if it's the amp sim or the combination of my guitar and this amp sim, but it was so prominent I had to deal with it. And then I realized this narrow cut wasn't going to do it because that octave part is moving up and down the neck, so the notes are changing. So I had to cover bigger range of frequencies, hence this sort of wider, strange looking cut here that's got the dynamic part engaged. That's just to cover everything as it moves up and down. I only really want this to work hard when this big deep cut here isn't really working because the notes that are being played are being moved away from that, if that makes sense. And then this is where we were having some of that sort of digital amp sim noise and hiss that I wanted to get rid of. So it looks crazy, but actually there's logic to it and it's not too bad when you break it up. So let's go through it like we did the last one. Hopefully you can hear there when I bypass the EQ. Like I was talking about with the rhythms, you've got that almost two sounds happening. You've got the main tone and the clarity and everything, and then you've got all this noise and extra stuff that you don't really want. So you just have to work hard to remove the extra stuff and keep all of that character that you want from the tone. Let me show you that again. Yeah, and that's how this is why these octaves sound so forward, is because the mids are so prominent. But with the brightness of the rhythms, and we're going to do some boosts brightness wise for this too, just it really brings it forward. We'll go through these harsh cuts first because they're the most obvious, and then we'll do this sort of low mids and mid-range stuff that we worked on. So hopefully you heard there, it was removing harshness and noise. This top one here is just pure digital amp sim noise, right? Now let's do this weird looking 2K double cut we've got going on. That's the spike I was telling you about. That's just huge, and that's just overpowering. That had to go. But then we've had to cover more ground because that octave part moves up and down the neck with this wide one. You can hear as that guitar part moves, you can hear it pinch your ear on certain notes, and that's why that's important. That's why that's wide, just to cover all of those bases. Cool, honkiness. So this purple one, this just under 7K, that's the real honk. This one here at 1K, I like 1K. I don't always cut it, but there's build up. So in solo, that one might not make as much sense. Pay attention to this one, important though. This is the real honk. Yeah, that 1K cut actually in solo, I think to myself, shouldn't have cut that. That's a really important part of the sonic makeup of this tone. But we are going to do some boosts later on around it, I suppose, that bring it forward. Okay, so moving on, we've got Soothe again to help with that extra harshness. And it's that just above 2K build up that I'm just trying to get rid of because it really was jumping out at me. And the more I was mixing this, the more I could hear it. So I was sort of driving myself crazy. But if you do end up using this amp sim, I'd watch for that sort of 2K build up somewhere around there. Yeah, you can really hear that hiss go away, right? That whistle go away. That's dramatic. And Soothe is so good at killing just that. You just have to not go too crazy, but be quite specific about where you want it to work. But that really did pull out just that whistle. It took me quite a while to find that exact setting for this particular problem. Okay, now back onto our boosting EQ. Let's get some life into it here. A bit more conservative on the top end boost. But as you're going to see, I use a different shelf with a different EQ in the next step. So I'm going to bypass the EQ. Yeah, a really nice bit of shine on top and then a little bit of bite. So we've got 2K, they're bringing that back, but it's a slightly different area. So we could not do this tiny little boost if we hadn't worked so hard to kill the part that was jumping out before. So this is a nice, more wider boost. Only 1 decibel, but it makes quite a big difference. And then an 8K shelf to give it a bit of shine on top. So the 2K is the bite, and this is the sort of shimmer on the top. However, we use another plugin for the shimmer and bite. So a bit of 2.5K pushed in here. It just sounds different to the SSL 2K. And then airband. This plugin, great for its airband. If you want something that you can just, you're like, want to make it brighter, grab this, stick it on the 40K airband, and it's a nice slope that doesn't get harsh. It just opens things up. Let's have a listen. I will mute it and we'll bring it in. I can't tell you how good that sounds on octave parts, especially that air band. It just really puts the emphasis in the right place. So, for example, if we bring the whole mix in again, I'll mute that and I'll bring it in. That's why it's amazing. If you've got something that can do a 40 kilohertz shelf like that, then do it. But I struggle to find it in free EQs or sort of the ones that are sort of made for, like surgical parametric cuts. I'd recommend this all day long. In fact, let's hear the combination of EQs together. So I'll mute them both and I'll bring them both in so you'll see how important they are to how this sounds. Yeah, it's what gets them to sit where they need to be. The tone gets you 75% of the way, but this EQ just brings that magic that you're probably looking for. I know I was for a long time until I settled on these particular moves. Okay, compressor like before, a bit of squeeze, and then we finish it off with saturation. This time I did use the Saturn 2 on the warm tape send. Again, not dramatic, very subtle changes. And then a little bit of an aux send here for a lead guitar delay. So altogether we have the finished article. Yeah, and that's what's doing the delay here. Quarter note delay, bearing in mind that this song is pretty fast, so 205 BPM there. Yeah, here we are. Quarter note delay, completely wet because it's a send, and then roll off the low end. A bit of verb. That's what's cool about the Mariquin delay, is that you can add in these sort of like verbs, doublers, phasers, and stuff like that you wanted to. And then EQ in the delay because you want that to sit well too, and that's a sort of low, mid, and mid-range area. Because I just wanted it to be like a not bright and sparkly, but I didn't want it to darken the tone. Okay, cool. So leads. And this is quite a typical skate punk kind of lead, I feel. This reminds you of how that sounds. Yeah, cool. This is quite a fast picked riff. It's kind of intricate. I mean, it's not too tricky to play, but it's quite intricate. You need those notes to be even. So before we even get into the amp here, I've been limiting it with this LA2A compressor to make sure that the performance is even. I wanted every single note to be as loud as the others. You can kind of hear it working quite forcibly on the ring out part towards the end, but it doesn't sound bad in my opinion. This here is just because the pick that we had to use to record this was quite thin because it was quite a fast picked part. As the guitarist was playing it, heavier, thicker picks were causing a few more other strings to get knocked. And where it was so fast and it's quite distorted, it was making it sound a little messy. So we had to use a thinner pick. And because of that, we have this horrible picking resonance you can hear. Trying to fight that has been a nightmare, but this is roughly where it was causing us a problem. So that is literally cut straight out of the DI. Into amplitude again. And this is where the range of amplitude is great because you can pick from so many different amps. So I believe this is the Soldano SLO 100. I experimented with a few different amps, but in the end it needed to be something quite gainy and metally. But I didn't want, obviously you can go a lot harder with the distortion on this, but I didn't want to do that. And I definitely wanted that kind of like valve sound. But I did change the cab too. I went for this Messer 2x12 here. It's the rectifier horizontal if you do have the amplitude. Again, running in solo. And then you can see I've panned the left cab left, the right cab right. And again, 57 and a U87 on the cabs. So again, identical tones. Preamp overdrive just before 5. Master overdrive 1.2. Mids, but just literally nudged above 12 o'clock or above 5. Bass at 7. Treble at 5. Presence pushed high, but I think that was part of the default setting anyway. And then we've got the bright switch is on and the crunch is on too. And the overdrive is on also. So quite gainy, but quite cool at the same time. Again, if we remove all of the mixing and EQs and stuff afterwards, it sounds a little messy and it needs a bit of work. So jumping straight into the EQ, very similar stuff that from the tones previously. We've got our low and high pass filters. We've got, again, like the octaves, we're getting rid of that sort of like muddiness because it's obviously way higher than the rhythms and stuff like that. This is that fizz we were talking about with the other one, the more that sort of amp sim noise you get. And look, similar problems here, having to deal with that. So it probably is the guitar, to be honest, or the guitar wasn't helping, having the same sort of thing with this jumping out. Maybe it's the plugin, because I obviously didn't have to worry about this with the nollie, but either way, be careful and make sure you deal with this. Otherwise, the moves that come afterwards with the boosts aren't going to be able to work. So I'll take you through these two. Yeah, just a bit of harshness there. If we treat those as one cut, let's bring them out and in. Just has the effect of relaxing your ear a little bit, brings that harshness out of it. And then this 6K one here. Yeah, it's just digital amps, right? And then this sort of muddy bit down here is gone. You know, you don't need that in a lead part. Cool, soothe again. This one and the one before it are just a factory default, but edited a little bit. So with this one, I pushed the orange sort of 2K area up, and again at 4K. But I've usually with the default plugin, that's down, lower down. It's just the red one really that's boosted. But I've gone for a more general approach across the sort of harsh frequency area that you'll get with guitars. And then some compression. Again, the Renaissance Axe. This is trying to get every single note to be as clear and easy to hear as the others, so they're all even, so that none of the notes disappear. And then this EQ that's been doing these sort of magic boosts for us. Very similar to what we had with the octaves. A slight 8K shelf, and then a slight push at 2K. Almost identical. Funnily enough, I didn't copy and paste this over. I just landed on this by accident, but obviously it works for these lead parts. So again, let's bypass it and bring it in. Opens it up nicely there, and didn't need to be much brighter than that. I didn't think it was already cutting through real nice. And then a bit of Saturn 2 saturation, warm tape, sends to the same delay that we had with the octave part, but then we've got this second send here, and that's just like a doubler effect. So we're using the micro shift here, but any doubler would work. You can use the doubler, waves doubler, just to thicken it up a little bit, and that gives us this. Yeah, cool. If you want to see how I would go about mixing a whole pop punk song like this, then watch this video here. If you want to see mixing videos on all kinds of elements of mixing pop punk, emo and similar music, then check out my channel. There's loads of videos on there about that. So as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.